And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. It's great to have a guest that you, of course, will know from the many times on here and from his excellent work, the Epoch Times and on War Room and everywhere else. And that is Jan Jekielek. Jan, thank you so much for your time today.
Peter, I'm thrilled to be here with you.
No, it's great. And I've been delving through your book. Let me bring it up, and I am sure you'll be able to brandish it. But there is your book, Killed to Order: China's Organ Harvesting Industry and the True Nature of America's Biggest Adversary. And just that front page of the book actually hits home. It is a extremely readable book in terms of the different testimonies that come out in this as we delve into a very dark subject. But that is out. Skyhorse have published it, and it is out on the 17th of March. So just over 3 weeks out. Is that correct, Jan?
It is, and it's almost surreal. Actually, as you pointed out, I do have it. I do have a copy. It's sort of surreal to hold it in one's hands. This is my first. I'm sure for people that have written many books, this is not a big deal, but for me, it's a big deal to hold the physical book in my hands and be able to kind of see some of the effect of the work that went into it. Yeah.
Well, Gus, if you had put into book form all the interviews you've done, Jan, it would be an encyclopedia, I'm sure. Many volumes.
It would. It's been an unbelievable education for me, to be perfectly honest. But also, actually, on this issue of forced organ harvesting, I interviewed a man named Wesley Smith, who wrote a book called Culture of Death back in 2000 and then updated it in 2016. So he's been tracking something called utilitarian bioethics, which is a central theme of the book. I mean, I just didn't even know that language, right? At this point, when I first came across him, I actually tapped him because I was interested in this euthanasia in Canada and the rise of it and just sort of how it's growing so quickly. He's sort of been an expert on this issue because he's an expert on utilitarian bioethics, and that's just one vertical of many. And in order to have a system like this sort of very extreme variant of an organ harvesting or organ trafficking industry like what we have in China, industrial scale, state sanctioned, all that, you need to have a central point of utilitarian bioethics. It's kind of the organizing principle around the medicine there.
Well, I want to jump into, as I said to you before we went on air, I've gone through about three-quarters of the book. And despite the subject, it is a very readable book. You're pulled in by the stories of many of the individuals. And let me just, I mean, the introduction is called the China option, and you introduce a lady, May, and you give her story of someone who her organs are failing, and then here's about the China option. And you start with maybe not the angle you'd expect, but actually a recipient, someone who has benefited from this before you go in to the story. Maybe tell us why you started there with someone who has benefited, which may be a curious place to start.
Well, I mean, several reasons. And I think, the reality of organ transplantation is that the supply, right, is always a lot less than the demand. Because in any ethical sort of situation, right, you need to have someone who had a catastrophic accident. It's typically a car accident, actually. And they need to have been able to, they have to be able to match you. So our bodies reject foreign things that go into them. And so now, of course, there's special drugs that prevent that rejection. But ultimately, the closer you can get, like genetically, that's why sometimes if, you can actually give one kidney, a parent could give one to a child, for example, that's a much better match because the genetics are similar, the histology will be similar and so forth. But in most cases, right, you need to have a close match blood type, close match tissue type, and size too has to be kind of similar. And it's rare. It's rare to get that, right? So someone who is waiting for a kidney and maybe has a rare condition, right? Someone like May, perhaps, who's kind of a composite character from, different people I've encountered over the last 20 years as I've been working on this issue. They may feel desperate. Maybe they're doing dialysis, and dialysis, only, I think the statistic is something like half the people after 5 years of dialysis aren't with us anymore. So it's like it's significant. So you might basically have a clouded mind. You want to survive. You have children. You want to make sure that they have good lives. They have parents around. I'm giving an example, right? And you might, and you hear about this amazing opportunity where suddenly you can get an organ where none was available to you, and you might do it without really thinking through what you're getting into. And I think this happened, in fact, to people, right? So it's a system that exploits all sorts of people in all sorts of ways, right? Never, of course, the people that are killed to order to be used for these so-called transplant donors, but also the desperate people who need organs, right, or want organs. In many cases, I'm not talking about for example, I have one example in the book which is utterly shocking, right? Which I think you've probably read about already. It's three quarters in, where there's a woman in Germany. This was a former German explant surgeon who basically explained to me this story, and this would verify this is real. She's a heavy drinker, right? And she's basically created massive psoriasis of the liver. I mean, to her, and with some kind of unusual situation where it's like it's easier for the liver to get that psoriasis. And she went and got a liver transplant in China, again, fairly quickly, and then repeatedly did that. And she's on to her third liver now, right? So that's a whole different situation, because obviously this person knows, something really, ethically questionable is happening to get her those, but she keeps drinking and keeps needing those new livers. So there's a whole range of types of people we're talking about.
And I think chapter one was a really interesting story because you try and put yourself in the mind or in the shoes of someone who talks about this. And there's a lady called Annie, and she is the ex-wife of a neurosurgeon. But it says Annie went public. She estimated that her husband had personally forcibly removed the corneas from about 2,000 Falun Gong prisoners of conscience. And it talks about at the beginning they were taken separate places, and then when they got the money and they were no longer afraid, they started to remove the organs together. Talks about if the victim's skin was not peeled off and only internal organs were removed, the openings of the bodies would be sealed up, and an agent would sign the paperwork. And then she talks about how she became aware of this, and you realize she must be one of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, I don't know, of actually husbands or wives who find out what has been happening. And the story of her that her husband, thousands of these operations on Falun Gong individuals who seem to be alive in many of the cases as well.
So the story of communist China, just to kind of backtrack a tiny bit, right, is a story of real tragedy, right? You hear this story. One of the pieces of propaganda you often hear is that the Chinese Communist Party has lifted millions out of poverty. Okay, but the context of that is that they also created a situation where cannibalism was rampant, because the level of poverty was so low that there was just simply not enough food, and people were, eating their family members, and horrible, really horrible. Again, I talk about this, right? So kind of casually, this is very real. This is well documented in the history of the CCP through the Great Leap Forward and so forth, right? But so my point is, it's a history of tragedy in the sense that people in this system have always been expendable. Okay, and that has manifested in all variety of ways. And the CCP has always picked, and aside from an external enemy, which has always been America, by the way, right? Someone to say, hey, look, it's their fault. All the bad things that are happening to you are their fault. There's also always an internal enemy, and the CCP picks a group, right? It was the landowners very early on in 1989 when the Tiananmen Square massacre happened. It was the pro-democracy students that were involved, right? In 1999, it became the Falun Gong practitioners. And whatever the part of the reason, they do this is because they don't like the group is somehow convenient. They view it maybe as a threat, or it's a kind of a convenient target for some reason. Like, for example, if you want to take people's stuff, so you go after the landowners and you make them bad, then you can take all their stuff and say, hey, we're doing the right thing here. right? I mean, there's all sorts of reasons, right? But what I'm trying to get at here is that everybody in Chinese society has, in their families, has lost people because of the cruelty and wanton behavior of the CCP, and everybody knows that. Okay, and there's a social credit system where, if you say the wrong thing enough times, you can't take the train anymore. I mean, and then it gets worse from there, right? Never mind, what, up in Xinjiang province, and where the Uyghur people are, incarcerated en masse now, a new addition to this horrible industry. We can talk about that later. But this is the framework. This is the context, right? You know that the CCP will harm you and your family. There's like that. It's the ultimate precedent is set so many times, again and again and again and again. And so if you're in this system and you somehow ended up doing kill to order forced organ harvesting, right? Uh, which by the way, I can describe how it works if that might be useful to our viewers. But like how what makes it different from your typical sort of organ trafficking situation, why it's so much more extreme. But everybody knows, right? Someone like Annie, she's making a calculated decision. Basically saying, and of course that's a pseudonym. That's not a real name. I'm ready to risk absolutely everything because this issue is something the regime will never admit to. And it's a gross crime against humanity. Anytime you kind of lay it out, people go, "Oh my God," or for years actually kind of wouldn't want to listen, frankly, because it's so macabre and so horrible. And the whole regime is coming after you. The full force of the regime is going to come after you. So for her, right, that's why there's so few people that will actually come out and say, my husband, we have a few surgeons that have done it. But none of these surgeons, to my knowledge, were involved at the time when it starts to scale and go into this really large scale thing. Before 1999, when they incarcerated the million plus Falun Gong practitioners, which facilitated this geometric growth of their transplant industry, right? Building thousands of hospitals and all that. Most of those surgeons are in situations where they were called out in the middle of the night. There's one example, right? And there's guards and there's clearly someone alive, and the head doctor says start cutting, and what's going to happen if you don't, right? And you just kind of do it, and then you have to live with it for the rest of your life. That's Enver Tohti as one surgeon like this. And of course, I document some of these scenarios, but it's very hard to get those people to come out and so sort of whistleblow because they know the consequence could be the elimination of their entire family, all sorts of horrible things. So
Well, I mean,
um,
probably going to back, I think chapter 5 is the evidence in the road to get there, and I think it starts or gives in it a timeline back from 1984, the regulations on organ procurement, and then on through a lot of these stories and testimonies. So maybe set the scene a little bit because we've jumped into some of the testimonies, but set the scene to kind of what has happened, and then maybe the first time you begun to hear about this.
well, so what happens is, and I theorize about this in the book, because we don't know exactly who started this large scale forced organ harvesting, but you need a very specific scenario. First of all, you need to be able to have a power, like a state actor, in this case the Chinese Communist Party, state level actor, who can basically push massive coercive power through a population. And of course, the CCP has established itself that way for generations now. You have to be able to dehumanize a large group of people because we can't just hurt people as human beings without believing we have a reason to. It's like a kind of a trick that's played on us when this sort of what we call, I'll call it hate propaganda, but basically propaganda designed to dehumanize people. When that's pushed into a population, that plays a trick on our psychology and allows us to think to ourselves, well, it's actually okay to harm them because they're different or they're raw or they're bad or something, right? And so you have to be able to do that because most people are not psychopathic, even if some significant portion are in communist societies. I also talk about this in Kill to Order that I believe through some really amazing work that's been done, that it sort of brings psychopaths into positions of power at an unusual rate. Let's just say that particular system is sort of almost like kind of guarantees that. But you have to be able to propagandize effectively, and then you have to be able to incarcerate a massive group of people, say a million, maybe two. It's not clear. These are state secrets. You can be killed for sharing them. Again, this is the setup, right? And so when the CCP does this to Falun Gong practitioners in 1999, and just a little bit of background there, we're talking about people who are doing a traditional qigong system, okay, meditation, slow motion exercises, truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. These are the core principles. People are living this, and it's also very unusually grassroots as a kind of, or it's not really even an organization, if you will, but it's very different from communism. Okay, and this is one of the my theories as to why they were so, particularly serious about trying to eradicate the Falun Gong, to use the dictator at the time's Jiang Zemin's words for it. By the way, eradicate didn't mean kill everybody, but it could mean that. And if other methods don't work, right? This is kind of what happens throughout history, actually, when they say, "Oh, well, we need to get rid of these people." It just sort of escalates from something that's non-killing to ultimately killing. And with the Falun Gong, they found that these people are very, very difficult to re-educate, or what they call transform. And so they made a rule: people in the prisons and the labor camps and the forced labor camps and everything, will be considered, all deaths of Falun Gong will be considered suicides, which just meant that you can use whatever method it is to break that person. And they did really horrible things. I'm not going to get into here in itself, but it set up this situation, right, where there's this dehumanized group of people. You're allowed to do whatever you want to them. And some very evil person thought to themselves, wait a second, we can actually monetize this. We can actually grow a transplant industry around this, right? So they started blood typing, tissue typing, organ scanning these people and creating a database of their vitals, right? And that's how, and prior to 2006, before we started doing deep research on this, there were even ads online that said, in 2 weeks or some very short period of time, you can get a new heart if you pay 150 to 100 grand. We have those archived, right? And the only way that can happen, right, is, again, in a sort of civilized, ethical transplantation system, you have to have someone have that catastrophic accident. And the likelihood that they're going to match you is low. And that's why you have to wait for years sometimes to do it. But here, someone is basically, their vitals are in a database, they're incarcerated, they can't get out, and if you match them, they can just be shipped and killed to order once the cash is paid. So that's the setup. That's what we're dealing with, and this has been happening, to the tune of, and I'll frame it in terms of that evidence chapter, right? It starts in the year 2000, and the whole system grows geometrically. They build thousands of transplant hospitals and all the infrastructure and everything. And by 2005, it kind of starts plateauing. And then by the late 2000s, we're talking about 60 to 90,000 transplants per year by our best estimate. So it's a very large scale thing, a lot of money. We estimate it's about a $9 billion a year industry. There's different ways to calculate that. Again, these are rough estimates, obviously, right? Because you don't have, the Chinese Communist Party, first of all, doesn't give you data around this stuff, right? And second of all, if they did, you wouldn't believe it anyway, because for all of their data is not very good. So you have to kind of glean it from data that you happen to get on certain things which are related, and make estimates and inferences and so forth, which is indeed how we get these numbers.
What, you mean there's no FOIA in China to get this information? What, you shock me, So
Well, but the other thing is, it's actually really hard to get good information because, see, the way it works is people are highly incentivized to report to the government, to their superiors. It's wildly, I call it obscenely hierarchical communism, okay? So like, you really want to make your superior happy. If you don't, you suffer, okay? And if you do, you get lots of benefits. So if the 5-year plan or whatever is, you need to hit this target of X, you better believe that you're reporting I'm hitting this target of X, right? So that it also complicates trying to understand what's really happening there, because there's that sense of reality. Of course, you couldn't report something that's, or maybe it's hard to report something that's very divergent from reality, right? Like opposite. When I mean when you're inside the system, right? But still, I'm sure people will do, because again, the consequence of reporting wrong, right, is not what is you're expected to deliver, are actually pretty serious, right?
Um, Another part is the believability of this, and when you first hear of this. Now, I remember when I saw Falun Gong people in London holding up signs, organ harvesting, and you kind of look at them strangely and walk past and think, well, there are some crazy people in the world, I guess. And even today, going through the book, Jan, and talking to one of my kids about this, and we were discussing, really, is this sounds like a conspiracy theory? This is just too big. No way. What about you as a journalist? You talk about Epoch Times being willing to cover this, but you as an individual, I guess, willing to accept that this does seem true, and then following that trail, there are a lot of steps to that. And why, kind of, what pulled you in? What made you believe this when many think this is just a crazy idea just to demonize the CCP?
Well, there were multiple steps, and so, probably in the year 2000 was when I realized, the general sort of let's call it the narrative, okay, around communist China in the year 2000 was something like this is a little bit glib, okay, but it was something like, they're really liberalizing very well, through our help. We're putting a lot of cash into that country. We're helping them change. In fact, they're almost democracy. Actually, there's still a little bit rough around the edges, right? Which is, a bit perplexing, because they had just, in '89, they had, mowed down 5 to 10,000 students, right? So that wasn't a sign of liberalization, clearly, right? And it was very
Which
prominent.
I don't
Yeah.
think our children hear about that in the education system. That we forget history so quickly, and I think if our children were learning about even that one part of history, we would maybe see China very differently.
Well, and that's, they've had and I have a whole chapter dedicated to the United Front Work Department, right, and influence operations. So we've had all these types of Confucius Institute type Chinese Communist Party influenced educational organizations that have attached themselves to American universities in UK and all over the world, to make sure that when people talk about China, they don't talk about the Tiananmen Square massacre. The regime propaganda was, it was the students that attacked the soldiers, actually, right? And yeah, so exactly, right? So, but the biggest thing to understand is propaganda is unbelievably effective, right? Because some portion of the population believes it straight on. Another portion kind of doesn't really know what to believe, but that's what they've got. So it kind of, sort of gets into your system. And so if you work very hard at one, pretending it never happened, disappearing it, two, demonizing people who suggest it was real, but they do all this, by the way, with Tiananmen Square, right? Um, it kind of fades from memory over time. It hasn't entirely, because there's people that are, heroically keeping the memory alive, including some mothers of some of the students that were killed there, and just that's why that it's so critical to have that, right? But bottom line is propaganda is very, very effective. But I already knew in 2000 that this liberalization thing was false. I knew that people were being tortured in terrible ways for simply refusing to break, to refusing to basically mouth the Communist Party required narratives that their belief system was evil or something, right? Or actually, a part of that deal that they had to. So typically, the Falun Gong would be given a sheet. It was like three things you have to agree to. One of them was you give up your beliefs. Another one was you have to help re-educate others, right? To kind of like play your part in well, what it really means is breaking others, right? So to speak. So a lot of people, I mean, this is I think, again, one of the reasons why I think the Falun Gong were so particularly hated by the communist regime, is they were unusually resilient to being forced to do these things. And I think part of it is that the system, it's a very self-directed practice. So that all the people doing it were really doing it because they really felt it was important enough to them that they were going to do something that, didn't fit into the, you know, explicitly into the Communist Party rubric, even though it wasn't political. Like, there wasn't a kind of a political agenda to it. It was more like, I want to live these principles, right? Truthfulness, compassion, tolerance. I want to be able to, and so remember, right? Going back to 1999, you had to kind of convince the population that these people that are kind of being, maybe model citizens, even, they're kind of living unusually well in these communities all over China, suddenly, no, they're actually evil and you have to hate them. Um, that's that. And but they put, I think it was like 500,000 individual pieces of propaganda into the system, right, to try to kind of convince, and obviously convince some people they did. But the moment that this whole um, the moment I realized this whole thing was real was really when I started looking at, um, I don't know, this is a story I tell very early in the book too, because there's, you mentioned Annie and that whistleblower. Near at the same time, there was another whistleblower of sorts who was a professor of transplant surgery at the Tel Aviv University, actually head of the Israeli Transplant Association at one point. He had a patient who told him at one point, he was a heart surgeon, that he's going to China to get his new heart in 2 weeks. And Jakob was just kind of shocked at this, because there's no way in an ethical situation this could possibly happen. But the guy actually went and did it and came back. And then, so this was, so in a way, that story to me played a very significant role to solidify. I found the testimonies from Annie and related research we did. It was just so fantastical. Then we started doing phone calls, right, to hospitals and asking questions, like, and basically people would say things like, "Yes, I can get you an organ in 2 weeks." Unbelievable stuff, unbelievable stuff, right? And even the Falun Gong organs, yes, we've got those. They're the best, like, you wouldn't even believe that people were actually saying things like this, but they were. Um, then there was this, whole situation in Israel where actually they enacted the first law to stop people from the system from paying for transplants from China. When Jakob discovered this, he kind of campaigned for several years. In 2008, there was a law in place about this already, which is, rare in the world. Like, there's actually 6 states right now that have laws like that in the US, but that's only since basically 2021, I think. Uh, so that, I mean, all this was happening, and then there were two Canadian human rights lawyers, David Kilgour and David Matus. David Kilgour, may he rest in peace. Um, they looked at all available evidence around this, and they asked themselves, because of course, there was no one walking in on a room where someone is being forced organ harvested, right? Like, it's very hard to get that kind of evidence. We have a survivor now. That is astonishing, but that he only really came out in the last few years. I never even thought we would ever see one. But at the time, they found 17 lines of evidence, all pointing in the fact that this was happening, and they tried, like, legitimately, they tried to find evidence that there was some sort of legitimate organ transplantation system that would explain the transplant volumes that were happening in China at the time. But they simply were not able to find anything. And the regime to this day has never provided any evidence, like credible evidence, that they have a legitimate organ transplant system. They just sort of attack the messenger. It's just you're evil. This is a propaganda of the people that don't like us. Whatever. That's all. That is essentially the totality of their responses. So they at one point they pretended in 2015 or so. They said, Well, actually, first they denied using prisoners for organs, okay? And then around 2015, they say, "Well, actually, we did use prisoners, for organs, but we no longer do, and now we have a legitimate organ registry, right? Organ transplant system." And they provided data. And the data was shown by one of the amazing researchers on through the years of all this, a man named Matthew Robertson, to be a perfect quadratic equation, meaning they invented the data and they didn't even do a particularly good job in trying to invent it. They just sort of, it's obviously falsified data. So that's kind of where we're at. And it was this sort of this 17 lines of evidence that really solidified in me that this was real. Although the moment I understood that they got that heart transplant, when I had a credible case that a heart transplant was obtained in 2 weeks, scheduled, right? I already knew that there's something really horrible is happening because you have to know when someone's gonna be dead if you're gonna schedule a heart transplant, and how could you know that? There's only one way you can know that, and that's if you're making them that way, right? And that's just one case, and we already know there's something horrible. The question is what and how much, and so that took some months to kind of really, and I had the revulsion, by the way, right? You mentioned this is so horrible, you don't wanna know about it, right? I experienced that myself, right? It's not like I am very sympathetic to people. I didn't want to believe this. Who wants to believe that stuff like this happens? Nobody, right? I mean, no normal people. So it was hard wrought, so to speak. And and then I realized I have to kind of, I've done my best over the years to try to report on this whenever we sort of there's more credible information, more research done. And now that we have 20 years of this work, including a China tribunal, which happened between 2018 and 2020, kind of looking at all the available evidence. I mean, they spent a year sifting through it, and they found absolutely this is happening at large scale, and so forth. And it's likely that the Uyghurs were added. This is one of the tragedies, right, of the whole thing. There's actually a man named Ethan Gutman, who's another hero researcher of this whole scenario. He's writing a book as we speak called The Xinjiang Procedure, where he looks at the best available information specifically about the organ harvesting from Uyghurs. The way I kind of the view this, right, is 14 or 15 years into no one really doing anything about it, sort of the world turning a blind eye to this organ harvesting from Falun Gong practitioners. The regime picked a new group, dehumanized them, incarcerated million plus, and added them to the organ harvesting fodder, so to speak. And this is the tragedy. And there may be others that are added in group. This is, like why would they stop, right? If there isn't some really good reason, leverage to get them to.
There was and I think it's chapter 5 where you talk about that survivor, so the viewers and listeners, to get that, jump in on chapter 5. There was another chapter which started off about an individual working in, I think it was a manufacturing or car plant, and then over the tannoy one day came, they were being called a traitor, and then it went back to their story of how they're a wonderful model citizen, but but they were Falun Gong, and it talked about how they were arrested. They were told to recant that, then ended up, I think, 8 years in prison. And kind of that story goes on. And you're right that these individuals, probably in many countries, would be very good citizens, doing what they're supposed to do, treating others well. And yet they are targeted. And I think, from reading it, you talked about maybe, is it 60 million or 80 million Falun Gong followers, something like that. So it's, again, I think it's difficult for us to understand in the West the anger that the CCP system has against these people, which I guess is about a fear of losing control, really.
So this is the amazing thing here is, right, that when the CCP started persecuting the Falun Gong, initially, for a number of years, the way the Falun Gong practitioners reacted was also kind of unprecedented. They just approached the whole thing as a big mistake, right? They would go to um, talk to these officials and say, "Look, we're great people. Like, we're not doing anything bad. We're not doing anything wrong. Like, this is all a colossal misunderstanding. You should fix this. And by the way, it's really bad for you to be hurting people. And now, wait, you're torturing people? What are you doing torturing people? That's crazy. Like, what's wrong with you people, right? Like, this is bad for your karma, right? This is like, you can't torture people and get away with it. You have to be accountable, right? You're gonna have to face your just desserts from this one day, right? So these were the conversations, right, that were happening. And some years in, there was this realization, right? And this was around the time that actually we published a book called The Nine Commentaries on the Communist Party, right? This is actually a book published by the Epoch Times. The Chinese editors of the Epoch Times, some of them were going to remain nameless because this became the #1 banned book in China very quickly. It was the first history of Chinese communism written by Chinese for themselves. Okay. And this book resonated in a major way. And, again, it instantly became the #1 banned book, and also the one that everyone wanted to read, right? At the same, because that's just how that works. But there was this realization that, the system's the problem. It's communism that's the problem. It's like these people are not listening. We're not doing anything wrong. There's no problem, really. But these people are deeply committed to trying to destroy us. Well, what are we going to do? Well, I guess we have to explain to people. What else can we do, right? We're going to explain to people what the problem is, and the problem is communism, right? And also that we're good people and that we practice truthfulness, compassion, tolerance, and not these horrible things that the government keeps saying about us. All that is false. And so actually, they, in a way, the CCP inadvertently created what some people argue is the largest extent civil disobedience movement in the world right now, where people, as we speak, millions of people are wandering through China, talking to their fellow man and woman, and explaining these things, right? And in some cases, I remember Freedom House reported on this a few years back. There's some provinces that, despite this persecution being egregious, an extreme and a crime against humanity level, there's some provinces where it's actually gone down because of these efforts. Because at some point, right, remember, like, you have to dehumanize, but what the Falun Gong are doing are kind of the opposite. They're humanizing, right? They're saying the problem is actually communism, and it's this inhuman system. But actually, these people, all these people that are being demonized, they don't deserve to be demonized. And some people are listening, right? So if you want, in your answer to why the CCP originally um hated Falun Gong so much, I think Sam Brownback, going back now full circle, he said something like, I'm from Kansas. When you drop wheat on the ground, it just grows. Okay. And he said, this is why when Falun Gong, this is ancient Chinese belief, right? Faith. And it's very natural to China, and it's very natural to people who are there. But I think there's an extra step here. And the extra step here is that um, I explain why in communist societies, the pinnacle of what's important is the supremacy of the party and the survival of the party, and every other societal important element, right, is subservient to that. Okay. And here you have millions of people that are basically saying, no, it isn't. It's
Yeah.
just not. And in fact, on our, work, our everything we're doing, you know, by the millions in the streets, is a living testament to that fact, right? So, and in a way, it's the ultimate undermining of that regime, because it is an inhuman system, and but it absolutely wants to preserve itself at any cost. And the only thing it really can't crush is the self-motivated, incredibly decentralized, deeply committed, individuals who are actually looking to kind of do good in the world, and try to, have a better society, a better China. So I think ultimately that's the reason.
and that thread goes through that supremacy of the CCP, and everything must be done to keep it going. I want to leave the second part for the viewer and listener. Part one's new form of evil, which we've talked about. Part two, the global implications of China's forced organ harvesting industry. Chapter 8, Zero Sum Games, really interesting how the CCP views the US. Chapter 12, a great title, Fatal Attraction, how the US views and connects with the CCP. Those are all fascinating, but I maybe just want to finish off. I'll leave that section for the viewer and listener to enjoy without commentary, but I want to ask you about the reception you have had it. I know it's not actually out, although you do hold a copy, but we can get a copy on the 17th of March, and the links are on the description there. But the amount of endorsements you've got
Yeah.
really was I thought this is a list of the great and the good. In fact, I was talking to one of those people today before we
Mhm.
did this about something else. I thought, by the way, I've got Jan on, and oh yeah, I wrote an endorsement. And it seems as though there is a concern. It wasn't silenced when you wrote this book. It's been kind of at long last, someone's willing to talk about what we have heard in dribs and drabs. Tell us a little bit about that, the support you've had, and you could have just done a whole book on endorsements, Jan.
But I reached out to I was told that this is a very serious issue. Not a lot of people aren't gonna wanna believe it. So you need to get like a mountain of endorsements, right? I didn't know how many would come back. So I just said, okay, I'm gonna write to a lot of people, right? Because I need a lot of endorsements. I didn't know how many. But in the end, it's just kind of wild. I got a little bit over 80 people wrote back, and some of them, quite prominent, people. And I'm thrilled to have, for example, Dr. Phil. And I only really met him, relatively recently, right? But I thought, hey, what the heck? And he read the book in its entirety and was blown away by it. And now he's, on the cover endorsing it. It's kind of unbelievable. But I guess to say I didn't know that there would be this many people would actually respond, because people tend to be busy, right, and so forth. But they did, and I'm incredibly grateful for it. But it also, I guess, reinforces my sort of supposition here, which is that I feel like finally society is ready for it, dealing with this. And I think there's part of multiple reasons for that. I think COVID is part of it. We saw what our own society can do. That's terrible. We saw what the CCP was doing, which is like welding human beings into their homes, right, to achieve this, in this weird zero sum, totalitarian mentality that they have, which doesn't even affect, it's like the whole thing is insane, right? Not even effective. Um, but I guess we saw it, right? And I think that was a part. I think the survivor coming forth, I think that played a role. What There's actually a guy missing part of his liver and part of his lung. Of course, I tell that story, as you say, in chapter 5 and a bit more elsewhere. It's amazing, but he exists, and he's a living testament to the fact that this happened. And they even admitted it. The craziest part is that through interactions, a very rare admission, they said, yes, we operated on him. Now they say they did it for different reasons, which is again kind of insane, but they admit that they actually operated on a guy against his will, who's happens to be missing a big part of his liver. Okay, so that was that, I think that's the one instance of such an admission that we've had. So I think I'm very honored by the large number of endorsements that came through. And I think it speaks to the fact that we're ready at least to stop our own complicity in this whole system, because there is, through that engagement, we've been, um, we the propaganda was we're changing them. I think the reality is the communists have been changing us in the wrong direction. Um, but that's something that's relatively easy to stop and could be done very quickly. And even doing that will have an impact on stopping or slowing, maybe, fewer transplants or something. I think there's things we can do very quickly to have an impact. And of course, spread the word. So that's my kind of agenda here, right? Is absolutely I want to see, people read this book, spread it. I do think it's very readable. I think, people can kind of it can help them understand who we're dealing with. And then also it will help us have policy, whether it's in America or Canada, my home country, um, uh, that reflects the reality of who we're dealing with. And I think a lot of our policy, even today, doesn't. And I think that that's another big part of the reason why I wrote this, because I want people to understand, look, we're dealing with people that do this, that have created a massive industry out of this, and are still going strong.
No, yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. I love reading a book that is not a copy and paste job, and there are so many books. I think on the right, Republican. I mean, how many books can you read about Trump saving the world? And I agree with that
Uh-huh.
to
Uh-huh.
extent, but
Uh-huh.
I think this is something that's certainly unique and has shown light on something that isn't as well known and is not just repeating what everyone else has said. So really appreciate you coming on and sharing. And hold, show us the front cover again before
Absolutely.
we.
Thank you for asking. I almost forgot to brandish the book. No, and so killedtoorder.com, you can get it there. It'll come on the 17th. I'm doing a bunch of book events and sort of both here in DC and other places. I'm going to be heading over to Hillsdale, have a talk there, talking with the students. Anyway, a lot of interest. Okay, and I'm genuinely like very grateful. And yeah, please buy the book killedtoorder.com. That's the quick link to the Amazon link. And become a part of the movement. And I also talk about how, people can get involved as just a regular person that doesn't even want to talk to government, doesn't well, you don't believe in government. There's all sorts of ways, and there's even a Rotary. So I've been a fan of Rotary Club over the years because I used to run these international youth programs, and wherever I would go and there was Rotary, I knew I could count on the Rotary people to help me. Right? They're like good folks doing grassroots work, right? And so they've actually created, if you can imagine, Rotary has created a club specifically focused on ending forced organ harvesting, which kind of pulls from other clubs around the world, and they all work together. And it's I was and just basic raising awareness, showing films, getting books into libraries, having presentations, book talks, whatever. They're all on it, right? They're doing it. So there's all sorts of ways. If people find this information compelling, it's all in there. I have a whole appendix dedicated to what you can do if you're interested.
Oh, thank you. 17th of March, make sure and get your copy. But Jan, once again, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Peter. It's been really wonderful. And thank you for paying so much attention and reading so deeply.